Imagine the grand halls of a medieval palace. Torches flicker against stone walls covered in rich banners, tapestries, and the coats of arms of powerful families. Musicians play softly in the background. Servants rush across the floor carrying silver trays of food and wine. To an outsider, this seems like a place of splendor, wealth, and majesty. But behind those gilded walls, a terrifying and humiliating practice often decided the fate of young women who had no say in their own lives. In the Middle Ages, a woman's honor was not truly her own. For noble daughters and princesses, their bodies were tools of politics, bargaining chips for power. Marriage was rarely about love. It was about alliances, binding kingdoms together, preventing wars, and strengthening dynasties. But these marriages required one essential condition. The bride had to be pure. Purity, in medieval terms, meant virginity. To kings, nobles, and clergy, the value of a young woman lay not in her intelligence or character, but in whether she could guarantee heirs untouched by scandal. A bride who was not a virgin was considered a threat. Her husband might be raising another man's child, and a rival kingdom could use that shame to destabilize the throne. And so, across courts in Europe, there arose a cruel custom: virginity tests. Some were conducted by matrons or physicians, who were ordered to inspect the young bride before marriage. Imagine a frightened 14-year-old girl, stripped of her dignity before strangers, her fate resting on their judgment. These tests were far from scientific. In reality, they were little more than humiliations, steeped in superstition and prejudice. Other times, the proof was demanded not before the wedding, but after the first night. The morning following the consummation of a royal marriage, servants or guards would stand waiting outside the bedchamber. They demanded to see the bedsheets, searching for the blood that was supposed to prove the bride's virginity. Those sheets would then be displayed publicly as evidence. A marriage alliance could rest on that single piece of cloth. But what happened when there was no blood? Countless girls suffered because biology does not follow politics. Some women did not bleed on their wedding night, and for them, the consequences could be devastating. They could be accused of deception, of immorality, even of witchcraft. A union between kingdoms could be annulled overnight, plunging both courts into scandal and war. And the young woman at the center of it all? She might be cast out, disgraced, or even executed. Imagine the terror of these brides. Raised from childhood to obey, to serve, and to carry the weight of dynastic duty, they found themselves reduced to a single test, a test they could not control. Their innocence was not measured by truth, but by the expectations of men desperate for certainty in an uncertain world. And so, the lives of queens and princesses were often decided not by battles or diplomacy, but by the stains on a piece of fabric. This was the brutal reality of royal marriage in the Middle Ages. Behind the splendor of crowns and castles, women lived as hostages of their own bodies. Their purity was not their own, it belonged to kings, to fathers, to nations. To truly understand the obsession with virginity in the Middle Ages, we need to step back and look at how royal marriages functioned. Unlike today, where marriage is often a personal choice between two people, in medieval courts, it was a weapon of statecraft, as important as armies, treaties, or trade. Every union between a prince and princess was carefully calculated. A daughter could be promised to a neighboring king while she was still a child, her future sealed before she even understood the meaning of marriage. In fact, many noblewomen were engaged as early as the age of 7 or 8, and by 12 or 13, they were shipped off to foreign courts to fulfill their roles. Why such urgency? Because daughters were not seen as individuals. They were bargaining chips. A princess might prevent a war simply by walking down the aisle. A duchess might bring lands or wealth to her husband's kingdom. A queen might be the key to uniting two rival dynasties. But all of this delicate political balance rested on one fragile condition: the bride's chastity. Virginity was more than a personal matter, it was political currency. If a girl was proven to be pure, she guaranteed that her children, the heirs of the throne, would be legitimate. If she was not, the entire alliance could collapse, and both kingdoms might accuse one another of betrayal. This is why so much pressure fell on young brides. Their value was tied directly to their bodies. Chroniclers of the time even wrote about the honor of royal daughters in cold, transactional terms, as if they were gold coins to be weighed and measured. One striking example comes from France in the 14th century. A marriage between two powerful houses nearly ended in bloodshed when rumors spread that the bride was not a virgin. Political rivals seized the opportunity, whispering in the king's ear that the alliance was tainted. The young woman, barely 15 years old, was publicly humiliated, her marriage annulled, and her family disgraced. The kingdoms that had hoped for peace instead found themselves on the brink of war. The cruel irony was that most of these girls were completely powerless. They had no control over their own bodies, their marriages, or their futures. Fathers negotiated contracts, kings dictated terms, and clerics blessed the unions. The bride herself was often just a silent figure in elaborate ceremonies she barely understood. And still, after enduring this, she faced the looming terror of the virginity test. Imagine the pressure. An entire realm, perhaps millions of subjects, waiting to see if her body would prove her worth. For the men of the court, this was seen as practical politics. For the women, it was living torture. Many must have spent their wedding nights not in joy or hope, but in pure fear that their bodies would betray them, that they would fail to produce the evidence required, and that the consequences would be catastrophic. The story of medieval marriage is not a story of romance. It is a story of power, politics, and control, and virginity stood at the very center of it all. The theory of royal purity was already cruel enough, but the reality was far worse. Behind the closed doors of medieval palaces, virginity tests were performed with shocking brutality and humiliation, reducing queens and princesses to mere objects of inspection. Some of the earliest forms of these examinations were carried out by older women, midwives, or matrons chosen by the court. Their job was to physically inspect the bride before her marriage. They would search for what they called proofs of virginity, the mythical idea of an intact hymen. Today we know this is medically unreliable, but in the Middle Ages it was treated as fact. Imagine the terror of a teenage girl, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, being stripped of her dignity while strangers handled her body, knowing her entire future depended on their verdict. Other times, physicians were brought in. Medieval doctors, lacking any real scientific understanding, relied on bizarre and invasive methods. Some believed they could tell a virgin by the tightness of her body, the color of her skin, or even the brightness of her eyes. These absurd tests carried enormous weight, and a single declaration could decide whether a marriage and an alliance between kingdoms would proceed or collapse. But the most infamous test came after the wedding night. In many courts, the consummation of a royal marriage was not a private moment. Instead, servants, guards, and even political advisors stood outside the bridal chamber, waiting for evidence. The next morning, the sheets were inspected. Bloodstains were considered proof of virginity, their absence proof of guilt. Those sheets might even be displayed publicly, paraded before courtiers as if they were legal documents. The cruelty of this practice cannot be overstated. Biology is not politics. Not every woman bleeds on her first intercourse, something unknown to medieval minds. Countless brides who were indeed virgins faced accusations of deceit simply because their bodies did not behave according to superstition. And what happened when the proof was missing? The results were often catastrophic. Some women were shamed before the entire court. Others saw their marriages annulled within days. There are accounts of noble brides sent back in disgrace to their families, who then bore the shame for generations. In extreme cases, accusations of lost virginity became grounds for charges of witchcraft or adultery, crimes that could lead to imprisonment or execution. Imagine the fear that must have consumed these women. On what should have been the most important night of their lives, they were not thinking of love or hope, but of bloodstains on a sheet. The entire weight of dynasties, alliances, and thrones rested on something utterly outside their control. It was not only the women who suffered. Families, too, could be destroyed by a failed test. If a princess was rejected, her father's honor was ruined, and his enemies used the scandal to weaken his power. Wars could be sparked over such humiliations. Entire kingdoms trembled because of superstition written in blood. This was the cruel paradox of medieval marriage. The queen's body was her kingdom's battlefield, and her virginity its most fragile weapon. But virginity tests were not only personal tragedies, they were also political tools. In the next chapter, we will explore how powerful men twisted these humiliating rituals into weapons of intrigue, using accusations of impurity to destroy queens, topple dynasties, and rewrite history itself. For many young brides, the virginity test was not just a humiliation. It was a moment that could decide the rest of their lives. A single night, a single sheet, or the word of a physician could mean the difference between becoming a queen or becoming an outcast. The most common consequence of a failed test was annulment. A marriage meant to secure peace between kingdoms could be dissolved in an instant if the bride was declared impure. She might be sent back to her family in disgrace, her reputation forever stained. For a princess, this was more than personal shame, it was a political disaster. Her family's honor would collapse, and their enemies would seize the chance to mock, attack, or strip away lands and privileges. In some cases, the rejected woman lived the rest of her life in obscurity, hidden away in convents or small estates. But others suffered even more tragic fates. Rumors of lost virginity often spiraled into accusations of adultery or even witchcraft. A young woman who failed the test could suddenly find herself on trial, facing public humiliation or punishment. One famous scandal shook the French court in the early 14th century. Several noble women were accused of betraying their husbands after questions arose about their purity. The accusations led to the infamous Tour de Nesle affair, where women of the royal family were imprisoned, shamed, and in some accounts tortured, all because men at court used rumors of virginity and fidelity as political weapons. The scandal nearly tore apart the French crown and changed the succession of kings. But not all tragedies were so public. Imagine the private pain of a young bride, exiled from her home, whispered about by courtiers, remembered not for her courage or kindness, but for a single night that did not go as expected. These women were erased from history, their names forgotten, their suffering ignored. The irony is that many of these women were innocent. Modern science tells us that virginity cannot be proven by any physical sign. Yet in the Middle Ages, superstition was treated as truth, and truth was often twisted by politics. Enemies at court could spread whispers that a queen had not been pure, and such rumors alone were sometimes enough to bring her down. For queens and princesses, their lives were never truly their own. They were pawns in a larger game, pieces to be moved, sacrificed, or discarded at will. And the virginity test was one of the sharpest weapons in that game. By now, it is clear that virginity in the Middle Ages was more than a matter of morality, it was a matter of politics. But what made this practice truly dangerous was how it could be twisted into a weapon. For kings, nobles, and rivals at court, accusations about a woman's purity were among the most powerful tools of manipulation. Royal marriages were fragile. A single rumor could unravel alliances that had taken years to build. And so, whispers about a queen's virginity or the lack of it became a favorite tactic in political games. It did not matter if the rumors were true. What mattered was perception. If enough people believed a queen was not pure, her position weakened, and with it, the stability of the throne. Consider the case of Anne of Brittany, a woman whose marriages were central to French politics in the late 15th century. Though her situation did not involve a literal virginity test, enemies at court spread endless rumors questioning her virtue. These whispers were not aimed at her personally, but at her husband, the king. By undermining the queen, they undermined the monarch himself. In the brutal logic of medieval politics, to stain the queen's honor was to stain the crown. Accusations could also be used to clear the path for new marriages. If a king wished to rid himself of a wife, the simplest route was to claim she had entered the marriage impure. With the support of church officials, many of whom were eager to please rulers, marriages could be annulled, queens discarded, and younger brides brought in to serve political ambitions. The church played its own role in this drama. Though it preached morality and virtue, it often became entangled in royal scandals. Bishops and clerics sat in judgment over queens, declaring whether their marriages were valid. In some cases, their verdicts were less about truth and more about bribes, alliances, or the king's favor. Thus, virginity tests became not only humiliations for women, but also tools for churchmen seeking influence at court. The most infamous example of politics weaponizing female purity was in England under King Henry VIII. His break with Catherine of Aragon, though centered on the lack of a male heir, was steeped in questions of whether she had been truly a virgin when they married. Catherine insisted she had been, but Henry used doubts about her past to justify the annulment. The result? Not only the fall of a queen, but the birth of an entirely new church, the Church of England. And so we see the true horror. These tests were never about biology. They were about control. Control over women, control over dynasties, control over the very direction of kingdoms. Virginity was less a state of being and more a political weapon, sharpened by gossip, polished by superstition, and wielded by the powerful against the powerless. For the women caught in this game, there was no escape. They lived every day under the threat that their worth could be questioned, their marriages undone, their lives destroyed, and they knew that a single whisper, a single night, or a single sheet could erase them from history. But history does not forget so easily. These tragedies, scandals, and injustices remain etched in chronicles and legends. They remind us that behind the crowns and ceremonies, medieval courts were battlefields, not of swords and shields, but of words, lies, and humiliation. For centuries, the fate of queens and princesses rested on a cruel illusion, the belief that virginity could be tested, proven, and displayed like evidence in a trial. Lives were destroyed, marriages broken, kingdoms thrown into chaos, all because of superstition treated as law. But like many medieval traditions, the virginity test did not last forever. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, whispers of change began to spread. Medical knowledge slowly advanced, and some scholars questioned the idea that a woman's purity could be proven by physical signs. Physicians started to admit, quietly, that the body could not reveal such secrets with certainty. Yet even as science took its first steps, politics remained stubborn. For many decades, queens still lived under the shadow of these humiliations. What truly weakened the practice was not science alone, but power shifting in other directions. As dynasties grew stronger and kings gained more centralized authority, they no longer needed fragile rituals to secure their alliances. Wars were fought with armies, treaties were signed with pens, and marriages, though still political, carried less obsession with bloodstains on a sheet. And yet, the damage had been done. The chronicles of history are filled with names of women who suffered because of this cruel custom. Some were banished, some were disgraced, some lost their crowns, and some lost their lives. Their stories remind us of the fragility of women's rights in a world ruled by men who saw them as tools rather than human beings. But there is also a lesson in resilience. Even in the face of such oppression, many queens rose above their circumstances. They endured humiliation and still became powerful figures in history. Some turned the very weapons of rumor and scandal against their enemies. Others built legacies that outlasted the men who tried to destroy them. Their voices may have been silenced in their own time, but history remembers their suffering and their strength. Today, it is almost unthinkable that a woman's worth could be judged by such a test. And yet, the echoes of this tradition remain. The medieval virginity test stands as a warning of how fear, superstition, and politics can combine to strip away dignity and humanity. It is a reminder that progress is fragile, and that the rights we take for granted today were not given freely, but won through centuries of struggle. So when we look back at the castles, the crowns, and the glittering halls of the Middle Ages, we must remember what lies beneath the surface. Behind the splendor were broken lives, silenced voices, and the cruelty of a world that demanded proof of purity from those who had no power to refuse. This is the hidden truth of medieval queens. Women trapped between crowns and chains, forced to carry the honor of nations on their shoulders, and judged by stains on a sheet. And it leaves us with a final lesson. Power without compassion becomes tyranny. When society reduces human beings to symbols, when dignity is replaced by ritual, tragedy is inevitable. The virginity tests of the Middle Ages were not just humiliations of women, they were humiliations of humanity itself.